I've seen a lot of things in my 30-plus years on the bench. People who think a handshake is a legally binding contract for a Ferrari. People who think personal responsibility is a suggestion. And people who think I was born yesterday. But there is a special category of nonsense reserved for tenants who think that because they found a house on Craigslist, they suddenly have the right to occupy it like they're the rightful heirs to a kingdom, regardless of whether they've actually paid a dime. I looked down at the files sitting on my bench. Arthur Henderson, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, was suing Chloe Miller and Brian Yates for $3,500 in unpaid rent and damages to his rental property. Across the aisle, Chloe and Brian were countersuing for $5,000 for illegal eviction, emotional distress, and this was my personal favorite, loss of property. I didn't even have to look at their faces to know what I was dealing with. I could smell the entitlement through the folder. Bird. I called out. Bird didn't even look up from his desk. He just handed me the police report and the original listing. Ready when you are, Judge. Let's get the circus started. Bird, swear them in. Once the formalities were out of the way, I leaned forward and fixed my gaze on Arthur Henderson. He looked like a man who had tried to do a nice thing and got bitten for it. Mr. Henderson, I started, my voice sharp. You are suing for back rent for the months of October and November, plus the cost of cleaning and replacing a front door lock. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. I just wanted to rent my mother's old house out to a nice couple. I met them on September 15th. We agreed they would move in on October 1st. I told them I needed the security deposit and the first month's rent before I handed over the keys. Simple enough, I said. A 5-year-old could understand that. Did you get the money? No, Judge Judy. They kept saying the wire was pending. Then, on September 20th, 10 days before the lease was even supposed to start, I got a call from a neighbor saying there were people moving furniture into the house. I turned my head slowly toward Chloe and Brian. Chloe was wearing a dress that looked like it was designed for a garden party, not a courtroom, and she was currently adjusting her hair as if she were on a blind date. Brian was leaning against the podium like it was a bar counter. Mr. Yates, stand up straight, I snapped. This isn't a lounge, it's a courtroom. He straightened up, but the smug look didn't leave his face. Now, Chloe, I said, ignoring Brian for a moment, Mr. Henderson says the move-in date was October 1st. He says he never gave you the keys. Yet, on September 20th, you were inside the house with a sofa and a U-Haul. How did you get in? Did you walk through the walls? Are you a ghost? No, Your Honor, Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Arthur told us we could start moving things into the garage early. He said the back door was finicky, and if we just jiggled the handle, we could get in to measure for curtains. Jiggled the handle? I barked. So you broke in. We didn't break in. We were invited, Brian chimed in. I didn't ask you, sir. Shush. I'm speaking to your better half, and I use that term loosely. I turned back to Chloe. You jiggled a door open and moved your entire life into a house you hadn't paid for? Is that your testimony? We were going to pay, Chloe insisted. But then we realized the house was a disaster. There was mold in the basement, the sink leaked, and the neighborhood felt unsafe. We felt we were lured there under false pretenses. I leaned back in my chair. I felt a familiar heat rising in my neck. This was the setup. They move in illegally, find a problem, and then use that problem to justify living for free. It's a scam as old as time, and they thought they were the first ones to invent it. Let me get this straight, I said, my voice dangerously low. You move in 10 days early. You haven't paid the security deposit. You haven't paid the first month's rent. You jiggle the door open, and then once you're inside, you decide you're the building inspectors? If the house was so disgusting and unsafe, Chloe, tell me, why did you stay there for 2 months? Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She looked at Brian. Brian looked at the ceiling. I'm waiting, I said. If I go to a hotel and the room is full of bed bugs and the ceiling is falling in, I don't unpack my suitcase and stay for 8 weeks. I leave. So why were you still there in November? We couldn't find another place on such short notice, Brian yelled. And then Arthur started harassing us. He turned off the water. I turned off the water because they weren't supposed to be there, Arthur shouted from his side. The utility bill was still in my name. They never transferred it. Of course they didn't, I said. Why pay for water when you can get it for free from the man you're robbing? I looked at the police report Bert had handed me. It says here, Mr. Henderson, that you called the police on September 21st to report a burglary. And the police arrived, saw them inside, and told you it was a civil matter because they had already established residency by moving in a bed. Is that what happened? Yes, Your Honor, Arthur said, looking like he was about to cry. The officer told me that since they had a claim to be there, I had to go through the formal eviction process. It took me 2 months to get them out. I turned back to the tenants. So, you used a legal loophole to squat in this man's mother's house for 60 days without paying a single cent. And now you have the audacity, the unmitigated gall to countersue him for $5,000? For what? What on earth could you possibly be suing for? Emotional distress, Chloe cried. He kept coming to the windows and shouting. He made me feel unsafe in my own home. I stared at her. I didn't say a word for 10 seconds. I just let the silence sit there until she started to fidget. Your own home? I asked quietly. Chloe, look at me. When did it become your home? Was it when you paid the deposit? No, you didn't do that. Was it when you signed the lease and handed over the rent? No, you didn't do that. It was never your home. You were a trespasser who got lucky that the responding officer didn't want to do the paperwork for a breaking and entering charge. We had a right to be there, Brian insisted. We had a verbal agreement. A verbal agreement to move in on the 1st, I snapped. Not the 20th, and not for free. You are not victims. You are predators. I picked up the photos of the house that Arthur had submitted. And what's this? Mr. Henderson, you're claiming they damaged the door? They changed the locks, Judge Judy. I couldn't even get into my own house. I had to hire a locksmith to get in. After the sheriff finally removed them, I looked at Chloe. You changed the locks on a house you didn't own? On a house you hadn't paid for? We had to protect our property, she said, as if that were the most logical thing in the world. I felt the gavel in my hand. It was practically vibrating. Protect your property? You didn't have any property. You had a U-Haul full of stuff and a brain full of nonsense. I was ready to end this. I had seen enough, but I wanted to hit them with the one question that would strip away the last of their pathetic, uninhabitable defense. Chloe, I said, leaning over the bench, you said the house was disgusting. You said there was mold. You said it was unsafe. You said the sink leaked so badly you couldn't use the kitchen. Correct? Yes, Your Honor. It was a nightmare. And that's why you didn't pay the rent? Because the conditions were so poor? Exactly, she said, looking smugly at Arthur. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile a shark gives right before it bites. Then tell me this, Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. If the house was so unbearable, so disgusting, and so hazardous to your health, why did you break in 10 days early to start living in it? Chloe's face went from a pale ivory to a blotchy, panicked red. She looked like a fish that had just been tossed onto a hot sidewalk. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Beside her, Brian shifted his weight, suddenly very interested in the scuff marks on the floor. I'm waiting, Chloe, I barked, leaning even further over the bench. If this house was a nightmare and a hazardous disaster, why were you so eager to jiggle your way inside 10 days before the lease even started? Most people, when they see a house full of mold and leaks, they run the other direction. You ran toward it with a U-Haul. Why? We thought we could make it work, Chloe stammered. We liked the layout. We thought maybe if we moved in early, we could clean it up ourselves and then ask Arthur for a rent credit. A rent credit? I laughed, and it wasn't a nice sound. You don't get to unilaterally decide to become a cleaning crew and then deduct it from a rent you haven't even paid yet. That's not how the world works. You don't walk into a restaurant, go into the kitchen to wash 2 spoons, and then tell the manager, your steak is free. It's baloney, Chloe. Total baloney. I turned to Brian, and you, Mr. Muscle, you're standing there like you're the king of the castle. You say the sink leaked. Did you call a plumber? I didn't have to, Brian said, trying to regain his swagger. I can fix a sink. But Arthur kept showing up and harassing us, so I didn't feel like doing him any favors. I told him if he wanted the sink fixed, he should pay for the parts and give us October for free. Give you October for free? I felt my blood pressure rising. Sir, you were already getting October for free because you hadn't paid him. You hadn't paid the deposit, you hadn't paid the rent, and you were living on his utilities. You don't get to negotiate a free month when you're already a squatter. I looked at the photos Brian had submitted of the disgusting conditions. One photo showed a small patch of dust behind a radiator. Another showed a water spot on a ceiling that looked like it had been there since the Nixon administration. Bird, look at this, I said, handing him the photos. Is this a hazardous environment, or is this just a house that's older than 30 years? Bird glanced at the photos and shook his head. Looks like an old house to me, Judge. Maybe a little dust, but nothing that'll kill you. Exactly. I turned back to the defendants. You took these photos to build a case for your illegal eviction countersuit. You thought you could move in, find a speck of dirt, and then hold Mr. Henderson's house hostage while you live there on his dime. You're not tenants. You're professional grifters. We are not, Chloe cried, her voice hitting a shrill, desperate note. We had $5,000 worth of electronics in that house. When Arthur finally got the sheriff to come, he wouldn't let us take our big screen TV or our gaming consoles. He kept them. That's why we're suing for loss of property. I looked at Arthur. Mr. Henderson, did you keep their electronics? No, Your Honor, Arthur said, his voice weary but steady. The sheriff told them they had 2 hours to move their essentials. They spent those 2 hours arguing with the officer and filming themselves for social media. They left the heavy stuff behind. I told them, through their lawyer, since they refused to talk to me, that they could pick it up the following Saturday at 10 a.m. I even hired a moving crew to put it all in the garage so they wouldn't have to enter the house. And did they show up on Saturday at 10 a.m., I asked. No. They showed up at midnight on Friday and tried to break into the garage. The neighbors called the police again. I turned to Brian. Did you show up at midnight? The gate was open, Brian yelled. We thought we'd just save everyone the trouble. The gate was not open, sir. You were trespassing again. I slammed the gavel once. Hard. You are obsessed with jiggling doors and saving trouble at midnight. It's criminal behavior. Now, Arthur, what happened to the electronics? They're in a secure storage unit, Judge Judy. I paid $300 to put them there because I didn't want them in my house anymore. I sent them the key and the address by certified mail. They refused to sign for the letter. Chloe, did you receive a certified letter? I don't sign for things I don't recognize, she said, tossing her hair. Well, then you're a fool, I snapped. You're suing for loss of property when the property is sitting in a storage unit waiting for you, and the only reason you don't have it is because you're too sophisticated to sign for your mail? Your countersuit is a joke. It's an insult to this court. I took their countersuit, the one for $5,000 for emotional distress and lost electronics, and I tore it right down the middle. I didn't even wait for their reaction. The sound of the paper ripping was the only emotional distress I wanted to hear. Your countersuit is dismissed, I said. And if you say one more word about your trauma, I'm going to have Bird escort you to the parking lot before I even finish with Mr. Henderson's claim. Do you understand? Chloe looked like she was about to explode, but Brian put a hand on her arm. He finally realized that the Pretty Girl Act wasn't working on a woman who had been a family court judge since before he was in diapers. Now let's talk about the money you actually owe, I said, turning to Arthur. Mr. Henderson, you're asking for $3,500. Break it down for me. It's $1,500 for October, $1,500 for November, and $500 for the locksmith and the door repair, Arthur said. They stripped the screws on the deadbolt when they changed the locks, and I had to have the whole frame reinforced. Sounds reasonable, I said. I looked at the defendants. Do you have any proof at all that you paid even $1 to this man? We tried to zell him, Chloe said, but the transaction was under review by the bank because he's a stranger. Do you have a screenshot of the under review notification? My phone broke, she said. Of course it did. I rolled my eyes. The dog ate my homework. The check is in the mail. And my phone broke the holy trinity of the dishonest litigant. If you had the money to pay the rent, you would have shown up with a cashier's check the moment the Zelle failed. But you didn't, did you? Because you never had the money. You were broke, you were looking for a place to stay, and you thought you could bully a 70-year-old man into letting you stay for free. I leaned back, feeling the weight of the injustice Arthur had suffered. A retired teacher trying to manage his mother's legacy, and he runs into these two vampires. Mr. Henderson, I said, did you ever give them written permission to move in on the 20th? Never, Your Honor. I have the lease right here. It clearly says occupancy begins October 1st, contingent upon receipt of total move-in funds. Bird, let me see that lease. I scanned the document. It was a standard lease, clean and clear. At the bottom, in the additional terms section, there was a handwritten note. Tenants may measure for furniture on Sept 25th by appointment only. I looked at Chloe. It says you could measure on the 25th. It doesn't say you could occupy on the 20th. You stole 10 days of occupancy, and then you stole 60 more. You are not only liable for the rent, but you are liable for the damage you caused to that man's peace of mind. I picked up my pen. I was ready to sign the judgment, but I wanted to address Brian's harassment claim one last time. Brian, I said, my voice cold, you said Arthur shouted at the windows. If a man steals your car and you stand on the sidewalk and yell, give me my car back, is that harassment? No, it's a reaction to a theft. You stole his house. He had every right to shout. He had every right to stand on his own property and tell you to get out. I looked at Arthur. You're getting your $3,500, Mr. Henderson, and I'm going to add the court costs on top of it. But I have a feeling these two don't have 35 cents between them, let alone $3,500. We have jobs, Brian insisted. Then you'll have a judgment following you to those jobs, I said. And every time you try to rent a new nightmare house, this judgment will be there to warn the next landlord that you are a pair of jiggling thieves. I was about to slam the gavel, but I saw Chloe's lip curl. She was going to say something. I could feel it. But Judge, she whispered, the mold. I have an inhaler now because of that house. I stopped. I looked at her. I slowly put my pen down. You have an inhaler, Chloe? Show it to me. She fumbled in her purse and pulled out a plastic inhaler. She held it up like a trophy. And when was this prescribed? I asked. 2 weeks ago, she said triumphantly. Bird, look at the date on that prescription. Bird walked over, took the inhaler, and looked at the label. Judge, this was prescribed to a Sarah Miller, and the date is from 3 years ago. The courtroom went dead silent. Chloe's trophy suddenly looked like a smoking gun. Sarah Miller? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Who is Sarah Miller, Chloe? She's my sister, Chloe whispered, her face now a ghostly shade of white. You brought a 3-year-old prescription belonging to your sister into my courtroom and tried to pass it off as proof of your own mold-induced illness? I stood up. I didn't just sit there. I stood up. That is not just lying, Chloe. That is fraud. That is a crime. I stood up, and for a moment, I didn't say anything. I just stared at Chloe Miller. I wanted her to feel the absolute weight of her own stupidity. This wasn't just a tenant dispute anymore. This was a woman who had the audacity to walk into a court of law and attempt to commit a fraud so transparent, so pathetic, that it insulted the very bench I sit on. Bard, I said, my voice vibrating with a quiet, lethal intensity. Take that inhaler. Put it in a plastic bag. I want it kept as evidence. Sarah Miller's prescription from 3 years ago. You brought your sister's old medicine into my house to try and squeeze $5,000 out of a 70-year-old man? In horror, I just grabbed the wrong one from the cabinet, Chloe stammered. Her garden party poise had completely evaporated. She looked like she was about to faint, or throw up, or both. Liar! I roared. I slammed the gavel so hard the water pitcher on the side table rattled. You didn't grab the wrong one. You went looking for a prop. You thought, I'll show the judge a piece of plastic, and she'll be so overwhelmed by my delicate health that I won't have to explain why I'm a squatter. You are a disgrace. You are a fraudster. And you, Mr. Yates, you're just going to stand there and let your girlfriend commit perjury in front of a national audience? Brian looked like he wanted a bolt for the door. I didn't know about the inhaler, Judge. I swear. I told her we should just focus on the sink. Oh, shut up about the sink, I snapped. The sink is a lie. The mold is a lie. The emotional distress is a lie. Everything that comes out of your mouths is a calculated attempt to live for free on someone else's hard work. I turned my focus to Arthur Henderson. He was staring at the defendants with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He probably couldn't believe people like this actually existed outside of a movie. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, the kind of softening you give to a person who has just witnessed a car crash. Where did they live before they jiggled their way into your mother's house? I don't know for sure, Your Honor, Arthur said. They gave me a reference from a landlord named Steve. But when I tried to call Steve after they moved in, the number was disconnected. I suspect Steve was just one of Brian's friends. I looked at Brian. Who is Steve, Brian? Is he a landlord, or is he the guy you play video games with while you're supposed to be at work? Steve is a legitimate property manager, Brian insisted, though his voice lacked any real conviction. What's his last name? I don't remember. What's the name of his company? It's just Steve's Rentals. Steve's Rentals? I rolled my eyes so hard I nearly gave myself a headache. Sir, you are a terrible liar. You couldn't even come up with a better name than Steve's Rentals? You're not even trying. You're lazy in your life, you're lazy in your work, and you're lazy in your crimes. I looked at Chloe. She was crying now, real tears, finally, because she realized she was in a hole she couldn't dig herself out of. Stop the waterworks, Chloe, I said. You're not a victim. You're a predator who got caught. You moved into a house illegally. You stayed there for 2 months without paying. You changed the locks. You harassed a senior citizen. And then you walked in here with a 3-year-old inhaler and tried to scam a judgment out of me. I sat back down. I felt a sense of profound disgust. These two were young, healthy, and perfectly capable of working and paying their way. Instead, they chose to be parasites. Let's talk about the Zelle transfer again, I said. Chloe, you said you tried to pay, but it was under review. Which bank do you use? First National, she whispered. Bird, get First National on the phone. No, wait. I have a better idea. I looked at Chloe. Log into your banking app. Right now, show Bird the pending or canceled transaction from September or October. If it's there, I'll take back everything I said about you being a liar. Chloe didn't move. She didn't reach for her purse. I changed banks, she said. I closed that account because of the trauma Arthur caused me by calling the police. Of course you did, I shouted. The account is closed. The phone is broken. The sister's inhaler is the wrong one. It's a never-ending cycle of excuses. You never had the money, did you? You didn't have $3,500 in September, and you don't have 35 cents now. We were waiting on a settlement, Brian blurted out. I froze. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. A settlement? What kind of settlement, Brian? Did you slip and fall in a grocery store? Did you get whiplash in a parking lot? Tell me about your other scams. It was a legitimate car accident, Brian said. But the insurance company is being difficult. The insurance company isn't being difficult, Brian. They're being smart. They probably saw you coming a mile away, just like I did. I looked at the total claim. $3,500. It wasn't nearly enough to compensate Arthur for the stress he'd been through, but it was the amount he had asked for. Mr. Henderson, I said, you're asking for $3,500. I'm awarding you every penny. but I want to make sure the record is clear. You did nothing wrong. You were a gentleman dealing with a couple of street-level hustlers. I'm also going to award you the maximum interest allowed by law, dating back to September 20th, the day they jiggled their way into your life. I looked at the defendants. As for you two, I'm not just dismissing your countersuit. I'm referring this file to the district attorney's office for an investigation into attempted fraud and perjury. You don't get to bring false evidence into a courtroom. You don't get to lie under oath about medical conditions using someone else's prescription. This isn't a game. Chloe let out a sob. Brian just looked angry. Don't look at me like that, Mr. Yates, I snapped. You should be thankful I'm not having Bird put you in zip ties right now. You've been living in a fantasy world where you can take what you want and sue anyone who complains. Well, the fantasy is over. I picked up my pen. I felt the sharp, clean lines of the law as I signed the judgment. It was a small victory for Arthur, but a victory nonetheless. Judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $3,500 plus court costs plus interest. I announced, the defendant's countersuit is dismissed with prejudice. And Bird? Yes, Judge? I want that inhaler sent over to the DA's office with a formal letter from me. I want them to know exactly what happened in this room today. You got it, Judge. I looked at Arthur Henderson one last time. Mr. Henderson, good luck with the house. I suggest you install a very expensive security system, one that doesn't just rely on a finicky handle. Thank you, Judge Judy, Arthur said, a look of immense relief washing over his face. I turned back to Chloe and Brian. Get out of my courtroom. And Chloe, give your sister her inhaler back. She might actually need it to breathe. You just wanted it so you could lie. I slammed the gavel. The sound was final, heavy, and perfectly justified. We are adjourned. I stood up and walked off the bench, my robe billowing behind me. I didn't look back. I could hear Chloe wailing in the background, but it sounded like music to my ears. It was the sound of a scammer realizing that the illegal move-in had finally, spectacularly backfired. I walked into my chambers and sat down. I took off my glasses and rubbed my eyes. People think this job is about the law, and it is. But mostly, it's about the truth. And today, the truth didn't just come out, it kicked the door down. Bird, I called out. Yeah, Judge, he said, poking his head in. Make sure you get the address for Sarah Miller. I want to make sure she knows her sister is a thief as well as a squatter. On it, Bird said with a grin. I leaned back and took a sip of my water. Justice was served. Now, if I could just find a way to stop people from being so incredibly stupid, I might actually get to go home early one day. But I won't hold my breath. I picked up the next file. Missing security deposit versus stolen cat. I sighed. Bird, next.